and he saw a person dressed all in black with a black hood right behind him.
And she looked up and she saw this man walk through the wall, the bedroom wall. He came over, stopped at the foot of her bed, looked at her, and then walked out the bedroom door and disappeared.
And as she gets closer, I can see that her eyes are perfectly black and her mouth is perfectly black. And she looks at me and says, "You are not welcome."
And it's the story of a preacher who was new to his town. He was meeting people and finding out their stories. And he kept hearing this story over and over again about this one house in the middle of town that was supposedly so haunted that nobody could live in it. Nobody could stay in it overnight without being scared away. And so it was abandoned there in the middle of town, and he felt strongly that the first thing he should do is to dispel this myth so that people would not believe in ghosts anymore and that house could be livable again. And so, letting everyone know, he decided that he would spend the night in that house alone. Armed only with his Bible, everyone watched as he walked up the front steps of the porch into the house and then disappeared for the night.
There are some people who believe in ghosts, and there are some people who don't. If you're the believe in ghosts kind, then this story is about one. And if you're the don't believe in ghosts kind, well, just for fun, this story is about one anyway.
Stories about ghosts, stories about the continuance of the spirit out of the body and how it continues to act in the world, are part of almost every religious tradition. And they go back in an American context, right to the beginning, from the very time that the first, Europeans arrived here, or even Native Americans also have stories of spirits that survive.
You look at those earliest settings around a campfire where people are staying warm, they have light, they have protection from wild animals, and they are sharing stories.
There are three big genres of storytelling that folklorists deal with, and that's folk tales or fairy tales, legends, and myths.
The purpose of a legend is to argue in favor of the folk belief that is buried in the story. You can have a folk belief without any narrative to it, and those in popular culture, those are called rumors. But when it gains a narrative, we call it a legend.
A legend's primary function is to call a worldview into question. So we all have this view of how the world works. And when somebody tells a legend, yes, it's entertaining, and that we might say is the primary function, the first thing it's supposed to do. But really it entertains by making you a little bit uncomfortable. And it does that, the type of legend we'd call a ghost story, it does that by making you a little bit unsure about things that you're supposed to be comfortable with.
It just means that there's a cognitive dissonance. There's a sense in which things I claim to believe and things I actually believe. And that's a lot of where ghost stories live. They live in that place, that area between what I know to be true and what down deep I think is true, that I don't want to admit is true. And that's the place that ghost stories really exist.
Well, once in the house, he looked high and low. He looked down in the cellar, which was empty, only a dirt floor, the main level, and upstairs, and he found nothing to be concerned about, nothing at all except a rocker, which he brought over to the fireplace, and he built up the fire, and there he sat by that fireplace, reading his Bible by the light of his lantern and the fire, and he was just nodding off. It was late in the night when he heard from the other side of the cellar door the sound of light footsteps, a small person ascending the stairs. But then directly behind that were louder footsteps, the sound of heavy, thumping, thudding footsteps. And then there was the sound of a scream, of a young woman's scream, and it was cut off. And then the sound of a thud, and then the thumping sound of a body being pulled back down into the cellar. And then silence. Well, he was up out of that rocker, and he went to the door, and he went down those same steps he'd just been. And again, he found that it was empty, nothing but the dirt floor. But he felt strongly that he had heard many of those sounds. So this time when he went back upstairs, he left that door open to the cellar. He turned his chair around away from the fireplace so that he could face the cellar door. And again, he waited.
I have a story from when I was in the Army. This would have been back probably in around 2000, maybe early 2001. And we were doing a field exercise, which involved us just walking around the woods, setting up a bivouac, and then moving on to whatever we were doing the next day. It was just a really weird feeling in the air. And we finally got to an area that was clear enough that we could sleep, you know, sort of wedged between some trees. And we set up our camp for the night. And when I finally fall asleep, I have this weird dream where I'm sitting in a movie theater. And I'm the only person in the theater, and it's completely dark. There's just a little light so I can see the other seats. And then the screen turns white. And in black lettering, it says, "You're not welcome here." And I panicked, and I got up, and I ran out of the movie theater. And as I'm running down the street, I run into this figure of what looks like an old lady. And as she gets closer, I can see that her eyes are perfectly black and her mouth is perfectly black. And she looks at me and says, "You are not welcome." And I woke up startled and panicked. I was like, oh my God, and I'm looking around. And I noticed standing right next to me is my friend Reed. He's this big black guy, like 6'3", and he was standing there looming over me, which was scary. And then I noticed he's actually dead asleep. So I grab his, like, Reed. And he wakes up and he looks down and he's like, "What's going on? You're sleeping, standing right next to me." He's like, "Oh man, I had the weirdest dream." He's like, "Yeah, what was it?" He said, "I was in this perfectly empty town, and then out of nowhere, I saw this old lady walk up to me and she said, 'You're not welcome here.'" And so we were both freaked out. We were like, holy crap. So we stay up and do fire watch the rest of the night. None of us gets any sleep. We're back to back, you know, flashlights, like just panicking. And the sun comes up and it's still very dense, so we can't see much. We start getting lights, people start waking up. And then we notice that not 50 yards from where we've been sleeping was an old Revolutionary War cemetery. These were all over the place back there. We go up and there's chains around it in every graveyard there. Every tombstone is marked, like 1780, 1770 something. So that was a really unsettling experience for me.
I would argue that those people who don't believe in ghosts during the day. And that at midnight, in a dark room or out in the woods, by a campfire, somebody's telling you this story, and if they're good, you maybe believe a little bit. Or there's this great line by a folklorist anthropologist named Andrew Lang. It's, "I don't believe, but I tremble." It's that uncertainty. That's where the entertainment comes from, and it's the only way it comes. It's the only way it works is by calling into question everything that we're supposed to be comfortable with.
As if, and historians have written about these kind of continual beliefs in spirits or witches or demons or whatever it may be as a kind of a fringe movement, that's the kind of like strange holdovers, it's primitive, it's the poor, it's people who are not well educated, and the statistics absolutely do not pan that out. 79% say miracles happen today as they happened in ancient times. 68% say angels and demons are active in the world today. 37% of people believe that houses can be haunted. 21% believe that you can talk to the dead. These are 79 and 68% of modern Americans who are part of this long Enlightenment program, supposedly. And yet, they don't accept the basic understanding that the rules of physics are constant, which is the kind of underpinning of science itself. They do think that the way the world works is contingent on invisible forces not forcing it to work a different way. And that puts us in a very different place than we often like to think that we are.
There has always been a gap, I guess, between that which we can pretty much figure out and that which is left to the unknown, that which is left to faith. So even as the scientific method and other forms of research discipline have evolved, there has always been a place in our minds for wondering about things that we can't substantiate.
This time he heard them, just those soft footsteps coming up the stairs. And then, when they reached the top of the stairs, no other sounds followed. he saw a shape begin to materialize there at the top of the stairs. It was a young woman's form, and she was wearing a white flowing gown. And he could see that in her youth she was probably once beautiful, but now the skin was falling away from the bone, and her eye sockets empty except for a blue glowing light. And he was so startled by what had appeared to him that he handled it poorly. And he shouted out, "Who are you? What do you want?" And she just faded, disappeared, down through the floorboards, back down into the cellar. And so, holding his Bible now in front of him like a shield, he waited again. And it wasn't long before he heard those soft footsteps coming up. He saw her begin to materialize again in front of him. And this time he was ready. This time he said the right things. He said calmly and loudly and firmly, he said, "In the name of the Father and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?"
When I was growing up, we lived in an old farmhouse out in the country, and my mother told me that shortly after they moved in there, she was sitting up in bed reading a book, and she looked up and she saw this man walk through the wall, the bedroom wall. He came over, stopped at the foot of her bed, looked at her, and then walked out the bedroom door and disappeared. She described him as kind of a young man, white shirt open at the collar, dark pants. So she, being the good Catholic she was, said a prayer and went to sleep. Next morning, she made my dad tear off all the wallpaper from the side of the wall where the man had walked through, and they found a door that connected the two bedrooms. And hanging on the door was a belt and a tie from a man.
This is a room that has a lot of banquets and things like that in it. And so at certain times, especially in the evenings, people are coming and going a lot, especially from the doors that lead down to the kitchen, and also the two different doors that lead out to the hallway. And one thing that the people had noticed was this painting is kind of odd in the back. It's a painting of a woman named Mary Quick Burney, who was a patron of the arts, and she had a lot of portraits done, including one of herself, which is hanging in here. She didn't like it, that's the story. And so she refused to let it be finished. And if you look at the painting, you can see that the hands aren't finished and it's not done. And when it was hung, supposedly she wasn't very happy about this. She died some years before. And so she haunts this room. And the way you know that she's haunting it is that she'll lock and unlock the doors at random times, you know, stopping people from bringing food in and things like that. Also, if you're standing in the hallway and you look in the crack between the doors, supposedly her mouth will smile in different ways. She'll open her lips so that you can see her teeth, and she'll close them at different times, and it's pretty creepy.
I'm Frederick Lauren, and I've rented the house on Haunted Hill tonight so that my wife can give a party. A haunted house party. She's so amusing. There'll be food and drink and ghosts, and perhaps even a few murders. You're all invited.
Okay, an interesting way to think about it is that the places that are good for telling ghost stories accumulate ghost stories. So a brightly lit room is not going to do it. You know, you're not going to be able to create the mood in the story that you want reflected with the storytelling. So it helps to isolate things, to isolate people, for one thing. This is a reason why, you know, out in the woods around a campfire, you feel alone, but there's the possibility of being intruded upon.
Attics, basements, unheated. Those are places where you see ghosts. Or perhaps in the forest where it's chilly and away from people, you might see a ghost.
The setting contributes to making the people feel like they're in the story and feel like the story's possible.
A really well-told story takes you there.
And it was as if his words released her, and she flew at him, and her arms reached out and grabbed him by the lapels of his black coat. She was so close, he could smell her. She smelled of earth and long ago death. And he saw those eye sockets empty but glowing with blue light. He saw the skin so removed that she couldn't speak. And yet words began to come from her, not from her mouth, but from around her. And she began to tell him her story. She told of how she'd loved a man and how he hadn't loved her. He'd only wanted her money. And how he'd killed her and buried her down in the cellar when she wouldn't tell him where her money was. And oh, preacher, she said, won't you dig me up? Give me a proper Christian burial so that I can rest in peace. And the preacher was able to just nod, yes. And so she continued, well, before you bury me, break off a bit of my pinky bone and put that in the collection plate this Sunday morning, and you will know who murdered me.
And on the first day of move-in, I was on my 5th or 6th trip, and as I was coming back down the attic, the way the attic worked is there were stairs that led up to a landing, so you couldn't really see the doorway out of the attic once you were up there. I was going to head back down to the stairs, or back down to the door, and as I got to the top of the stairs that led to the exit, at the bottom, silhouetted against the doorway, I saw just sort of a blackened figure. I assumed female, there was a feminine look to it. It was just a shadowy sort of outline. And I saw that and I panicked and I sort of fell and scooted back away from the doorway. So after a couple seconds, I got my courage up and poked my head up over and everything was fine. So I scurried back down out of the attic and I didn't see anything there again for the rest of the day. So I assumed all was well. A couple months later, I was up in the attic again, reading comics because that's where all my comics were. And I was going to leave and I saw the same figure, only this time it was about halfway up the stairs. And that really freaked me out because before I could lose sight of it, I had to back up considerably further and hunch down extra low, which was my first priority. I don't want to look at it anymore.
Every time I go to a school or a library or a park and I'm going to tell stories to a group, especially if it's children, but even adults, no matter what time of year it is, they say, oh, tell us a scary one, tell us a ghost story.
We tell ghost stories because we love to be scared. People love to be scared.
And I think that people want that. People want the shiver. I mean, they do, and I think they want it in their religious life, and I think they want it in their popular entertainment as well.
You know, when you're given a good scare, your heart beats faster, you get a kind of a pump of adrenaline, your hair may stand up on end. You know, we have these physiological reactions to being frightened.
And even if it doesn't fit in with the rest of the way they think about the world, it can be deeply pleasurable. At the same time, it can be deeply terrifying.
And that Sunday, he put that little bit of dried bone in the middle of this heavy gold plate with that velvet in the middle. And there it lay, a bit of dry bone. And yet, when he passed it back and forth amongst his congregation, nobody seemed to notice. Nobody commented on it. They just put their money in, as they always did, and passed it to the next person. Round and round it went, until it came to a man that nobody really knew. He was always alone. And he, too, reached into his pocket and brought out a small, small coin. And as he was about to put that into the plate, that bit of bone leapt out of the plate and began to dig itself into the back of his hand. It began to embed itself in the back of the flesh of his hand. And it was so painful and excruciating, he began to scream and yell and draw attention to himself, and he tried to pry that bit of bone out of the back of his hand, but as it got deeper, it seemed to take over his body. And there in front of everyone, he began to confess. He told of how he hadn't really loved her, how he'd only really wanted her money, and how he'd killed her and buried her down in the cellar, and how he wasn't sorry, but only wanted the pain to stop.
The living room already had its own entity, but it was pretty innocuous, and we called it Ghost Cat. The first time we heard it was really early after moving in, and we already had a cat Tiger, but we heard the sounds of another cat coming from within the wall, just a polite little meow. We're like, oh. It's a damn cat in the wall. And I figured that was possible because Tiger had gotten into the crawl space in the attic and gone all over the place, you know, and come out covered in soot. So I thought it was definitely possible that we got a cat in there. So we put some food and water in the attic to try to lure it out. And every now and then we would hear the cat. And we just thought there was nothing we could do for it. I was like, man, I'm just gonna have a dead cat in the wall sooner or later. But then we started to hear the cat make sounds not specifically in the wall, just in the living room. We'd hear a meow from a corner, and Tiger would look over there and like, he was angry and cranky. He didn't want another cat to be there. You would feel it jump on the couch. You would hear it scratching the walls, weird stuff like that. It's like, great, now I got independent confirmation that there's a ghost cat living in my walls. But it became just sort of an interesting, cute thing. People came over to visit and they'd hear something. Like, that's a ghost cat. He's harmless. I don't have to feed him, I don't have to clean the litter box. He's just there.
When my nephew was 16, he was killed in a car accident. I was away from home at the time. I lived in Bloomington. And a couple years after that, my 10-year-old niece, who had been sick from birth, died. And one weekend I was visiting my parents in French Lick and sitting on the bed reading a book and playing with my cat. And I looked up and my nephew was standing beside the bed. And he was holding my niece in his arms. And he said, excuse me. He said, "It's okay, I'm not alone anymore."
The particular variety of ghost story that we have, there are different facets to it, and one of the facets is that if someone exists as a ghost, they were taken before their time.
I bet if you looked at ghost stories in general, most ghosts are still here because some harm has been done to them and they're trying, or they did harm, and they're trying to clear the air or get something figured out before they move on.
If you look at our ghost stories, so many of them are about the memory of violence in a place that continues to act out itself again and again.
This is what she used on my brother and her sister. Hacked them to pieces. We found parts of the bodies all over the house, in places you wouldn't think. The funny thing is the heads have never been found.
I think we want to think that the events that we live through affect the places that we live in a way that's very fundamental. That we don't want to think that I can suffer a tragedy on a place and that place is the same after that tragedy as before. We want to, I think, and it's a hopeful rejection of the Enlightenment materialism, that suffering a traumatic event in a place marks that place somehow, and it continues to be hallowed or sacred or tragic. Even if it's tragic and horrible, it contains something that it didn't have before because our presence changed the environment. I think we want to think that something survives.
If you believe in an afterlife, then you are comforted by the fact that you will meet them again in a different place.
The embodiment of the spirit that lingers after death. Well, it's pretty difficult to prove this, even though people even today try.
And I think ghost stories are an attempt to prove that there is something after death. And I think people find them more credible because they don't want to give up completely.
And it's part of what we do as storytelling creatures to help figure things out.
And then limp, he just stopped his confession. And two men from the congregation, one on either side, helped him out of the church, down to the judge, where he was convicted of murder. Soon after, he was hung by the neck until dead. It wasn't long after that that the preacher went back to that house to see if she had moved on, if the house was free of her spirit. Well, when he walked through the house, she did seem to be gone. He saw nothing of her, but just as he was passing the fireplace, he began to hear her voice. Her voice was there, in the air, all around him. And she thanked him for what he'd done. And she did say that she could rest in peace. And she said that her money was there, right there, under the hearthstones. He should dig them up and use that money that had caused so much ill. He should use it for good in the community, and he did.
It's almost as if we're wired to use story, to teach each other, to maintain a history.
But they also help warn us about things or teach us about things to be wary of. I mean, how many times have we heard the story and we've said, oh, don't do that character, we're all worried if we wouldn't do it, but they're going to do it, and through that, you know, mistake or misstep that the character's making, we can learn something.
The inability to deal with death. Americans have a real hard time dealing with death. All of these things, I think, contribute to making ghost stories the most popular oral narrative in America.
And so folklore and legends in particular are a combination of things that are fixed and things that vary. And in the fixity, we can see that there are commonalities just to being human. And that's great. But in the variation, we can see that we're all unique, we're all interesting as individuals, as groups of people, as whole countries.
So in a way, for us to remain a coherent culture, we had to tell stories to maintain our sense of identity, to learn from the past, and to have an idea of where we were going.
It introduces us to other people's worldviews, to other people who believe things that we don't believe and have experiences we don't experience. And it does so, and this is the best part about it, is it does so in a way that we can comprehend if we pay attention.